Hi everyone and welcome to This Is Why We Fight. I'm Jo.
And I'm Jordan.
Hello. We hope you're all doing well. We hope you're having a fantastic day, fantastic evening. We are here, of course, to carry on our series, the Tyranny series on the Behavioural Insights team. And we are talking about the next section of the MINDSCAPE report. Hopefully you've watched last week's stream and you'll see that there's so much to go into, so many ways in which we're being manipulated, and we hope you found it useful and informative. How are you, Jordan?
I'm doing extremely well, thank you.
Good, very pleased to hear it. I hope everyone out there is doing well too. Without further ado, shall we crack on? There's loads to go through.
Yeah. Go.
Okay, so that did not quite go as I'd hoped.
Nice and smooth.
This is a professional operation. I have no idea what you're talking about. Okay, so we're talking about behaviour change and policy. And you'll start to notice as we go through this document that they interchange between them and us, all of us, them included. And you'll also notice there's a little bit of a... It's like they slip occasionally and a word will appear that doesn't seem to have a place in an official government type document. It's very strange. And we've been noticing this. You may not notice all of these because we're going to skip a large portion of this. A lot of this is just bump. Maybe they got paid by the letter, who knows. But we will cover the things that we think are pertinent. And at the end of the series, we will be providing a link to this whole document should you wish to go through it yourself. So without further ado, Jordan, do you want to start?
Indeed.
Okay.
Behavioural change and policy. As citizens, communities and policy makers, we want to stop bad behaviours. People vandalising our cars, stealing our possessions and threatening our children. We want to encourage good behaviours, volunteering, voting and recycling. We even sometimes want a little help ourselves to do the right thing, to save a little more, eat a little less, and exercise a little more. Though we may be ambivalent about how aggressively we want the state to intervene in these behaviours.
Well, how aggressively we want the state intervene.
I did notice that while I was reading, because I added the word to subconsciously.
Yes, it is correct, but it's a weird way to word it. How we want the state intervene in these behaviours. How aggressively? How aggressively should the state intervene in anything when it comes to your private behaviour?
Not at all, is the answer to that.
I mean, we've said this before, there are certain societal established rules, let's say, unwritten rules, if you will, even though they're laws, that you don't harm other people and you hope that they won't harm you. And bad behaviours I wouldn't class in the same basket, let's say, as, I don't know, murder. We're talking about bad behaviours, not harmful or evil behaviours.
Well, the examples they give.
Yeah.
Like losing weight. Since when is it the government's responsibility to help me lose weight?
Well, I suppose the government, they have to go through these benign little exercises in futility, trying to convince us that they want us to lose weight because it's better for us, right? But despite the NHS being a massive black hole, it's actually beneficial to the NHS if fewer of us use it. Because as far as I'm concerned, the NHS is just a money laundering exercise at this point. I mean, I don't actually see the purpose of it. It's not there to help people. The waiting lists are ridiculously long. The treatment is subpar. The service is questionable. And of course you are forced to pay for it. Whether or not you can access it. So, yeah, why does the government care if you're overweight or obese or whatever you want to call it? Why do they care about your savings?
It's really weird. They consistently use crime as an example throughout this document, but they've only mentioned it actually being, like their mind space concept actually being applied to crime twice.
Yeah, because they don't really care about crime. But because
they just love using it. Love saying we can solve crime.
Well, they can't, and they haven't, and that's the point. But they talk about crime like it's this external thing that doesn't affect them. And I suppose to most of them, the crime that is inflicted upon us never does affect them. Vandalising our cars. Do you think any of these people have had a car vandalised with the amount of police they've got watching their vehicles as they sleep? Stealing our possessions. Stealing! I wonder if that's what they...
from them, isn't it?
Yeah, I wonder if that's what they call it when they leave our data on trains and stuff. It was stolen, right? Someone took it by force. I didn't leave it on that train, Governor. Threatening our children. These people have all of the privilege and all of the security in the world. Who's threatening their children? Our children are threatened all the time. Who's threatening their children? How can they even speak of these things like they know what they're talking about? This is amazing, actually.
As we go through this, we're going to note that they constantly flick back and forth between us being all of us, just people in general, and us being
Us and them
as the government, and at another weird occasion where there's us being spoken about the general public. I've only noticed them using that term once in those regards.
Yeah, it's like pronouns on crack in this document. It's rather amazing. Like the royal we is mentioned so many times. Like they're in a gang and we're a part of it, but they're not. They're completely separate from us. And you'll see this as we go through. It's really amazing to behold.
But there's one of those royal we suggestions coming up shortly. Sometimes we can agree on how we would like policymakers to change our behaviour, and sometimes they nudge in those directions. But other times those nudges may have unintended consequences.
They nudge. These are the people who created the nudge. Who are they referring to as they, if not themselves?
Sometimes we can agree on how we would like policymakers to change our behaviour.
Oh.
Surely that actually means that if you agree you want somebody else to change your behaviour, you've actually changed it yourself and they haven't done anything.
And you've also given up control of your own mind and your own opinions and your own ability to live.
There is that as well. This is basically a tacit brainwashing.
This is Stockholm Syndrome on crack. This is, we're going to change your behaviour and you agree that it's best that we do so, yes? Because if you don't agree, there's something wrong with you.
If you don't, it's just an inconvenience.
9 out of 10 people agree that the government should change their behaviour. That's an example of another nudge. We'll get to that in the future. It's one of their clever little tricks they use to convince you that everyone else is doing something, so you ought to do it too.
I wonder where we've seen that before.
9 out of 10 cats prefer whiskers. They even do it to our pets, for goodness sake.
Hey, don't nudge my pet.
That's ridiculous. Sorry I interrupted there. Yes. So sometimes we can agree on how we would like policymakers to change our behaviour. No, I think the people who are engaging in the kind of behaviour that the rest of us would not like to be around don't actually care if somebody else wants to change their behaviour. We care, but we don't care about our behaviour being changed. We care about other people's behaviour changing. But we still don't agree that the state should intervene and change people's behaviour. There should be strict rules of life. You do not harm other people. You do not rape them. You do not murder them. You
do not steal from them.
There's no nudging there. There should be punishment for those behaviours. And anyone who's not engaging in those behaviours, the state should leave the hell alone.
This is not the government's domain. You cannot possibly conjure up a world where it is ever within the government's right to encourage us in any capacity whatsoever to save a little more, eat a little less, and exercise a little more. There's not their business. Nothing to do with them.
I wouldn't call it a nudge, but the government have certainly done their best to force us all to eat a little less over the last year. I wouldn't say exercise a little more, though. You know, that restricted, rationed exercise that we were allowed to do. Wouldn't that be eat a little more rubbish and exercise a little less?
Hey, just keep buying from Just Eats. It's all good.
Yes, don't forget, Just Eat, we're allowed to carry on as normal. Because junk food is the key to happiness, don't you know?
I did, slightly off subject, sorry about this. I did absolutely love their Eat Out to Help Out campaign. And people were saying, oh, this is lovely, you should do it more often. This should be a real thing.
Yes,
So
yes, let's waste the last bit of money we've got on restaurant food.
No, forget that. Do you people not understand that the Eat Out to Help Out thing was simply the government taxing you less? Like, congratulations, you've taken the actual conservative position of, if you don't have government taxing the living daylights out of people, people buy stuff. Who would have thought that was how things worked?
And also,
I just absolutely loved all the little Corbynistas on Twitter saying, oh, this policy is wonderful, you should have kept it going. Morons.
yeah, well, because it's never real communism, is it? And conservatism, the thing that they hate, they engage in all the time, voluntarily. But I guess it depends who the voice is, doesn't it? Who the puppet is, whether they hate them or love them. Do you think if Keir Starmer came out as a full conservative, they'd all just want to have his head?
Yes.
Because the ideology is more important than the group dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. It's not that they hate Boris or name that politician, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage. It's the zealous hatred of the ideology that they think these people espouse, and their zealous love of their own ideology, which they can't see because they're hypocrites, that causes them to behave in such hateful ways. Another nudge, if you will. Everyone's being nudged.
The irony is these people don't see that their ideological zealotry actually does nothing, because the people who are at the top, the so-called, like the controllers, the policy makers, as this document calls them, they're people like Tony Blair's aide, whose name I've forgotten. They're people like that guy. He was one of Tony Blair's top guys.
And now he's working for the Tories.
Blair went, Brown went. When this document was being written, it was a Conservative-led minority government.
Yes.
He just swapped colours. He doesn't care. It's completely irrelevant to him who is in power, because he understands that they're not the ones in power. It's people like this who are in power. Well,
this is the thing. It is all about power. People will often jump ship when they think someone else has the power.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, people are quite fickle in that regard. They'll always back what they think is the winning horse.
It's actually really telling, because this document at multiple times talks about policymakers as civil servants. They acknowledge that the people actually creating policy and putting it together are people who are unelected. They're not the MPs that we believe are doing it. And I find that an interesting slip. It's rare for them to acknowledge it.
Well, yes, because as you say, the constant use of the word policymakers rather than politicians.
Mm-hmm.
Or members of parliament.
Even ministers. I could understand if this document was worded in such a way whereby it was for ministers, and it was, sometimes we agree on how we would like ministers to change our behaviour. If it was language like that, but it isn't. It's always policymakers. It's very, very clear on that. And at a couple of occasions it does mention policymakers as civil servants.
And just remember, of course, ladies and gents, that the civil service rarely changes.
No, it hardly ever changes.
When the ideology in number 10 changes. So these people are opportunists. They don't believe in a particular political ideology. They don't really have any principles to stand on. They're just doing the job and taking the pay. And these unelected bureaucrats are making our laws.
Mm-hmm. So, these unelected bureaucrats read documents like this, which it also mentions in the next paragraph. Over the last decade, behavioural economics, which seeks to combine lessons from psychology with the laws of economics, has moved from a fringe activity so one that is increasingly familiar and accepted. This is the sort of document that's getting passed around Whitehall. Even though your local council office may not have heard much about it, may not have seen it at all, the people who are actually coming out with policies for governments are sharing these ideas around, and they're injecting them into everything that they're doing. Every little campaign that they start, it doesn't matter whether it's from DEFRA, the MOD, Department of Work and Pensions, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're all reading this sort of stuff. They're all working out ways to inject it into our lives.
I would also point out the fact that it says that it's moved from a fringe activity to one that's increasingly familiar and accepted. Not by us. They're not talking about us here.
Mm-hmm.
They are talking about themselves and each other. They are talking about civil servants. And the funniest thing of all is that they're talking about behavioural economics. Is that a phrase anyone was even familiar with before?
Your general population, no, I would say not.
Of course not. So therein lies the problem again. They speak for us until they don't, and then they speak for themselves. And that's very, very interesting indeed. Anyway, let's read on. Drawing on the most recent evidence, this report sets out the most robust effects that influence individual behaviour, demonstrates how these have been applied to major policy issues, and what more can be done, and considers the practical implications and political concerns about applying these methods. Political concerns. No government is going to try and impose a policy on the people that it knows they will reject. This is why they nudge you. This is why they try and coerce and manipulate, instead of outright proposing something they know will be rejected. And it's important to recognise that this is the case. This is almost always the case.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting way to look at what they're doing. They're basically testing the waters. That's why these nudges are important.
What would be really interesting to do, I'm not sure you'd ever be able to find out, that short of actually asking them outright, but find out how much of this concept, this mind space concept, and the phrasing such as that considers both practical implications and political concerns about applying these methods. How much of that stemmed from his experience with Tony Blair when they were trying to do things such as the Iraq War, and that was very, very unpopular. When they were trying to do things such as the national identity cards, and that was also incredibly unpopular, and they could never work out how to actually push it through.
Yeah, no. They're not going to ever push something like that through because they're never going to get away with it. That's probably what the foundational thinking for this whole project was.
That's exactly my point. It'd be lovely to find out, completely impossible, but how much of his experience in that situation has led to this? Because it kind of, the more we read it, the more you see little things like that. This document is basically, how can we implement very unpopular government policy without needing to actively do it? How can we trick the public into accepting it? Slowly, sort of thing.
Well, it makes you think, doesn't it? Because if they're doing this now for this, for MINDSCAPE and for the Behavioural Insights team, what were they doing before that existed? I mean, the behavioural psychology has always existed. We know that it's been a part of the FBI, for instance, since the mid-70s. So you'd have to assume that we have been psychologically profiled for decades, many decades. But this is why politicians lie. They haven't been clever enough to find a way to nudge us before they got all these big brains to come together and devote all of their time and their ambiguous words to creating reports for them to use. But we've always been manipulated. Every war was built on manipulation, wasn't it? Every behaviour that goes public, is based on manipulation. And that's no mean feat when you consider that the media, well, I'm going to start calling it the state media from now on. They have a massive part to play in these nudges and these manipulations.
Well, we'll be getting onto that in the next section, I believe.
Absolutely. There's so much at play here. It's very easy for people to look at one person or one group and say that this person or group is responsible for all the bad things that have happened in a name that period. This is so much bigger than one person or one group. This is just one part of a massive government department in a range of government departments. This goes up the line and across all lines. And if people think there's a difference still between Labour and the Tories, do you not think that Labour use these nudges too, these manipulations?
Well, I think the previous paragraph completely puts that to rest.
Exactly.
What is the exact phrasing? It's moved from a fringe activity to one that is increasingly accepted.
Yes. Not by us, by them. By the people who govern us. By our elected representatives who represent nothing and no one. So, very interesting that. So, political concerns aside, there are certain things the government want to happen, and they will happen. By God, they will happen. The question is how they get people on board and how they give this illusion of choice. But all the choices are the choices they provide. So if they want a certain outcome to be A, they'll give you the choices between A and B and C, but actually B and C will be softer versions of the choice of A. Either way, they get their way. They either get it hard or they get it soft. And if they get it soft, then choice A will come up again. And we mentioned this on the last episode, didn't we, when we were talking about France and Ireland being asked that question over
Denmark
and over
as
again.
well.
Denmark, yes. About whether they wanted to remain in or leave the EU. Once these things are decided, the nudges are arguably, they're just paperwork. They've already made their decision and they will have their way.
What would be really interesting, after we've gone through this document, if we just go through probably the post-Brexit period will be most interesting, and do a breakdown on that, an analysis of that using the MINDSCAPE principles, and see how much we can find. How many little nudges and nurdles they've put in.
It's really important for everyone to remember, though, and that's a really good analogy. A lot of the stuff that we focus on is the stuff we're afraid of. Most of that hasn't come to pass. And the stuff that we focus on is the stuff that we devote time and energy to. So think of it that way. If you devote the time and energy to things that you know are part of your reality now, taking care of yourself, taking care of your family, and stop worrying about the things that the media say will happen. They're only there to disseminate, to distract, to lie, to push, to nudge. But yes, as Jordan said, we'll cover that. So, okay, let's have a look at what's coming up next. So doing nothing is never a neutral option, this report goes on to say. We're always busy shaping each other's behaviour. For example, if governments keep a distance, markets may emerge to satisfy our preferences. While this often does not cause major problems, it can do. Markets rarely account properly for the good and bad spillover effects of our own behaviour on others. This is very interesting. Markets. If governments keep a distance, markets may emerge to satisfy our preferences. We talk about preferences again, not choices. I find it really odd that they're trying to justify their involvement in our private business by saying that markets can't do the job that state does.
Well, markets can't kill you quite as efficiently as the government does. Look at Stalin, for example.
But they can offer you choices, unbiased choices, that the state cannot.
There's something infinitely less creepy and off-putting about a private company marketing to you and trying to influence you to buy their product, as opposed to the government doing it.
Yeah.
There's just something very, very unnatural about that. It's very uncomfortable. It's because you have a centralized body of people who've decided this is the best option, you have to buy it, as opposed to the private market, which is saying this is the best we've got. Please buy it, basically, because you always have a choice not to buy it. Whereas the things these people are looking at, they're not really choices that you're engaging in. They go on about things like defaults, where they preset the option for you, and then you basically have to go along with it.
Well, it goes on to say this picture shows the need to recognise that government is just one influence on our behaviour amongst many others. Does the government influence our behaviour? I mean, outside of laws and legislation? Is there anything you do because government influence dictates it to you?
Not knowingly.
No, I think that's the case for most people.
Yeah, but this is where this document has become so toxic, I suppose. Because they've given the government the keys to manipulate us in ways which we don't even realise. Because ultimately you're not sitting there thinking, oh, I wonder if the government's behind this. You're just sitting there, you're watching what it is, you're taking it at face value.
Yes. Yes, because we still live under this illusion that private companies are working for the benefit of consumers because their customer base is everything to them, right? Except we've obviously found out that the reality is it's not so much the case. You've got these companies literally behaving in what can only be described as psychotic ways, like the Coke company. Surely,
Facebook, for example.
Yeah, they're surely behaving in ways that would harm their consumer confidence and their profits, but they don't care.
Is that the fact that Facebook years ago would have so much data on you, they would know when you were going to the bathroom? That's kind of insane.
And the interesting thing is, given the lack of government oversight, there's still this whole discussion about whether these things are publishers or platforms. Let's not forget who is now in charge of Facebook. And his very political career prior to that, which of course is the Lib Dem. Is it Lib Dem?
Oh, indeed it was. Nick Clegg, I forgot.
Nick Clegg, that. Yeah. So
when you said that, I was like, what's Zuckerberg done? No, he doesn't own it, for clarity's sake.
No, but he's the head of it, though, isn't he? He was given a massive position.
He's got a big position, but he doesn't own it. He doesn't run it.
Well, there's the mindset of an average politician for you. These people who speak, while they're in politics, who speak always about our personal rights and freedoms, don't care about them when it comes to earning a buck.
Mm-hmm. He would have been there during the Cambridge Analytica scandal as well.
Oh, for sure. There's another thing I notice they do. They constantly accuse other people of the things they are doing themselves, trying to put out the fire before it reaches them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. Such sweeping scepticism is unfounded, since there have been many policy successes in changing behaviour. For example, reducing drink driving, clunk-click, preventing AIDS transmission and increasing seatbelt usage. Nevertheless, some behaviours such as antisocial behaviour and lack of exercise have remained resistant to policy interventions. Why do we think that is?
Just the phrasing. Just focus on the phrasing. Such antisocial behaviour and lack of exercise have remained resistant to policy interventions. That's once again a very telling way to word this. If you're resisting something, it means that ultimately you don't really have much chance. It's just a matter of time. They're going to weigh you down.
Yeah, like stop resisting because this is going to happen. I would argue though that antisocial behaviour, as labelled by these big brains probably doesn't mean what everyone else thinks it means. Antisocial behaviour is subjective. What do you consider to be antisocial behaviour?
Playing loud music at night.
Okay, that's probably a given. What do you think they think antisocial behaviour is?
Oh, now that's a good question. They don't actually give any examples, do they?
No, it's all very vague and generic, isn't it? Lack of
That's
exercise.
an interesting point. I never noticed until then. They love pointing out like personal fitness things, personal health.
Because it's a safe subject, isn't it? Because I suspect they think no one will ever disagree that good health is a good thing. But again, it's all very vague references. There's nothing very specific in there. Lack of exercise. What are they talking about?
Sorry.
What are they talking about when they say lack of exercise? Are they talking about the lack of exercise everyone's engaged with for the last year? Because they've been on stay-at-home orders? Do they care about... They've talked about nothing else in this document.
I would argue that if this was written now, going outside at the moment will be considered antisocial behaviour.
Oh, yes. Putting grandma at risk.
Well, these were the people behind that as well.
Yes, they were. You'll find out about that in future episodes, and there's so much information on their nudges regarding the last year. We will definitely be covering that, so stay tuned for that. But you're right, the word resistant is arrogant, resistant, like what they want to do is normal and you should stop resisting. Lack of exercise. Maybe it's because the country has just fallen apart. People don't feel safe outside. Communities have been broken down. Gymnasiums are super expensive, and by the way, you can't get to them. Although I think I did read somewhere that the police have been using private gymnasiums all the time, that public ones have been under lockdown.
That wouldn't surprise me.
That's a whole other story. Yet resistant to policy interventions is very sinister phrasing. It's our way at all costs.
I don't like the government talking in terms of the public being resistant. Even though this is only a discussion document, not a statement of policy.
Well, yes.
Not a statement of government policy. Even with that warning, this is basically Whitehall saying people are resistant to policy.
People aren't doing what we want them to do. They're talking about us like we're children.
Yeah, it is. It's like two adults having a conversation back and forth about their unruly child. It's like these silly peasants that we have. They're very resistant to our policy interventions.
Well, we know they hold us in contempt, so that's not an unfair statement. I didn't highlight the next section, but I'm going to read it anyway. It goes on to say now this is them again, we need to think in more integrated and innovative ways about how policymakers can intervene in ways that help people help themselves, and that also help society reduce inequalities in health and well-being that are avoidable and considered unfair. Unfair by whom? You're still taking away people's choice. What are your thoughts on people who don't do anything to improve their own health? Should they have access to healthcare that they're forced to pay for?
Well, yes, of course. I'm not sure these people would fully agree with that, though.
Do you think that a future possible solution would be to make voluntary contributions to the NHS?
It wouldn't surprise me if they do bring something like that in, especially as things stand currently.
The last couple of decades have been very interesting. It struck me earlier, actually, and I forgot to mention it. But if you think about the way things are going, I think the state is very, very scared at the moment. I'll tell you why. The tide is turning and public opinion is turning on state. I don't know what the word is that I'm trying to think of.
The mood of the country is definitely turning against the state. It's not just going against the government at this point. It's
All of
the
it.
entire entity of the government.
Well, I'm thinking
People are
about the
not happy with it.
BBC, or this defund the BBC. That's the state broadcaster, the state healthcare provider. These are elements of the state itself. These kind of Big Brother type, like the BBC is essentially the same premise as the NHS, right? You have to pay for it. I don't know how the BBC managed to pull off the scam of the century by convincing people that you have to pay a license to watch live TV anywhere, on any platform, from any channel. But they did, and a lot of people are cancelling their TV licenses because the state broadcaster is... This is such a funny thing. People on the left, if left-right mean anything anymore, people on the left accuse the Tories of being the nasty party, the hard right Tory party, who I would argue are as liberal as they come. The state broadcaster has gone so far left as to be ridiculous, but they're the state broadcaster, and they're not unbiased. The state media, for goodness sake. People are turning against Big Brother in all of its forms, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
I think personal sovereignty has never been more important. And I think the more people realise that they're being forced and manipulated into behaving in certain ways that they don't agree with, or maybe they don't disagree with the behaviours, but they disagree with the ways that they're being manipulated into them. It's almost like a peaceful revolution that's going on right now.
And that is a part of what this document is ultimately trying to stop. They go on to say, we recognise that the most effective and substantial changes in behaviour will come from the successful integration of cultural, regulatory and individual change. Drink driving demonstrates how stiff penalties, good advertising and shifting social norms all combine to change behaviour quite significantly over a couple of decades. They're trying to... They keep using things, like examples of things everybody would agree with. Like, drink driving is stupid. I don't really understand why anybody ever thought it was an okay idea.
Zero tolerance. It's how it should have been. When they talk about, they've had to change this behaviour, well, they've allowed this behaviour to appear in the first place. They allowed it. They create the problem and then they come in with a solution. Again, I do agree with you. I think drink driving is awful because your car is a weapon when you have no control of it.
Mm-hmm. But if they're using things like that, it would be quite interesting to know how much of that was just people saying, no, we've had enough of drink drivers, and then the government tagging onto it.
Oh, yes.
Because that's typically what happens. The government very, very rarely does anything good by itself. Normally it waits for the public to say, okay, we need to do this. Slavery is a good example of this, actually. The thing that banned slavery was not the government stepping in and saying this is immoral, and then the entire country in uproar saying, oh, no, we can't do this. People were saying that this is absurd, we can't have this practice anymore. And then the government was sitting there trying to justify it for about 25, 30 years. That's something that goes completely forgotten about. The average member of the public was quite against it.
Because the average working class member of the public knew exactly what it felt like to be owned and controlled. Even
ignoring that aspect of it, slavery is very, very bad for the lowest part of the economic strata. The poorest in society do not like slavery at all because you've got literally free labour doing what they should be doing for cheap.
Yes.
And they'd rather a little bit of cheap than nothing at all.
Yes. Yes, I agree. There's different kinds of slavery, and all of them are bad.
Anyway, it goes on to say, here we focus on the role that behavioural economics can play in shaping individual behaviour, rather than on the ways in which legal and regulatory systems can compel us to behave in particular ways. We are interested in the soft touch of policy rather than the heavy hand, going with the grain of human nature rather than rubbing us up the wrong way.
Ah, us.
I was just about to point that out once again. The phrasing.
What do you think they mean by its heavy hand?
We're interested in the soft touch of policy rather than its heavy hand. I don't know. It's actually a very strange way to phrase that.
Because they say the soft touch of policy. So they're not talking about a nudge here. They're talking about policy versus something else, much harsher. What would be harsher than policy? If you're taking policy to read legislation, essentially a law, what would be harsher than a law? What would be more formal and final than a law?
Right, 1 minute. I've read this again. I think I've worked it out. We're interested in the soft touch of policy rather than its heavy hand, which is making something law. I think what they're on about here is policy as
a guideline.
That's actually a bloody good point. Exactly, like the COVID guidelines. They're not actually law. That's a soft policy. It's a suggestion that you should do something.
But it's being delivered with a heavy hand.
Oh, when it comes to the 2 meter distance and things like that, yes, it is. But I think that's how they're breaking this down. The soft touch of policy are things like guidelines. You should do this. You should,
9 out of 10 people are doing this, right? You do want to be a part of the majority, don't you?
Yeah, that sort of thing. Like the default setting for your workplace pensions being set to yes as opposed to no. That's a soft touch of policy. The heavy hand alternative of that would be
law.
Yeah,
this
like
is
you
law,
don't have
you
a yes no
obey.
option.
Okay. Exactly. What about the next sentence? What do you think of that?
The basic insights from behavioural economics.
Going with the grain of human nature, rather than rubbing us up the wrong way.
I don't like that.
Well, first of all, do they even understand human nature?
First off, I don't like whenever the government talks about rubbing us. It's very uncomfortable.
Well, we know they do a lot of that in inappropriate manners. So, we'll skip over that. But going with the grain of human nature would imply that they're talking about not forcing people to accept absurdities and unrealities. And yet, they do tend to do this quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Can you think of an example, Joe?
Oh, many. Many examples.
Surprising.
Oh, let's see. The disgusting porn parades once a year under the banner of pride.
Let's not forget those.
Is that the grain of human nature? Because I would argue that it's not. It's forcing us to accept or tolerate something they know that we find repulsive.
Well, the fact that they call it tolerating as opposed to anything else.
Welcoming.
Yeah, we should be more tolerant.
Well, I tolerate putting the bins out. It's not my favourite job. It's a job I tolerate because it has to be done. Drag queen story hour. Allowing these people to... I've always been very confused. I've read so many books and writings from people in the gay community. I'm not going to read out the letters, so everyone knows what I mean. Where they talked about in the 60s wanting to be accepted by wider society, right? Which is perfectly reasonable. And that they used to have their pride marches in the 60s. And how they used to dress for them was very interesting. They would wear suits and dresses to show the wider society that they are just regular men and women. What happened?
Well, they're wearing suits now. They're just leathery and mostly missing.
I wonder if these are the same people who are vegan. Just out of interest. Ethical vegans. But I'll turn up in my leather suit with a chain round my neck and walk on all fours in front of your children to show how liberated I am. Amazing. Anyway, moving on. Okay. So the next section covers the basic insight from behavioural economics. We're not going to focus too much on economics because all I hear is GDP, blah, blah, blah. And we're all a bit sick of hearing about that. But anyway. Let's get to it. Often the decisions we make in the blink of an eye serve us well in everyday life. But for some of the more complex decisions we face in the modern world, our unseen patterns of thought leave us puzzling and frustrated over our own decisions, stumbling on happiness rather than confidently making choices that get us there. These insights can be used by marketers and others to influence or nudge what we do and what we choose. Isn't that interesting? Stumbling on happiness. What do we think about that? Like we are just stumbling our way through life. We don't really understand what's happening. My God, do we need the guiding hand of a government to tell us what to do?
The soft hand, though, not the hard one.
No, of course, because the hard one would be a little too harsh.
Exactly, that'd be too much. We just need the little soft one.
I find it
interesting.
Oh,
Sorry,
go on. No, go on you.
What I was going to say is I didn't really notice this when we were reading through it earlier on. The way that they're conflicting what they want to do with marketers. Because as I said earlier on, intrinsically we don't have an issue with marketers using these techniques. There's nothing actually wrong with it because it's a private company. They're just trying to improve their own business.
Oh, yes. Increase sales or build up their customer base.
Exactly. It's honest as well. You know, when you see marketing material, you're not sitting there thinking, wow, this is absolutely 100% true. You're sitting there thinking...
They're trying to sell a product.
Exactly. You know what they're trying to do. You're not messing around. You know they're trying to sell you a product. You know they've packaged it in a certain way. They've used certain colours, all the rest of that. They're just trying to increase sales. Fair enough.
Actually, I've got another example of that. Like with Dove or something, 75% of consumers said that this was their number one choice.
Mm-hmm.
There's another nudge.
Example.
But it's a company trying to sell a product, so you expect it.
You expect it and you just kind of tune it out. You don't really pay too much attention to it. But the sort of nudges these people are talking about, they're not nudges in those ways. They're nudges that are also backed up in one way, shape or form by government policy. So they're not the same thing. By trying to conflate the two, it's actually incredibly dishonest.
Yes, because the free market nudges are still a consumer choice. They're still a choice. Because you don't have to subscribe to something to access it. You can buy it or you can choose not to. Mm-hmm. When the government engage in their soft nudge, what they're doing is setting you up for a permanent hard nudge. And the nudges that the government engage in are behavioural to the degree that your behaviour is coerced, controlled, and dictated. If a company says, well, you must, skip for 10 minutes a day before you can use our product, you say, okay, I won't use your product, right? You're not going to dictate my behaviour in exchange for this product. But if the government say you need to do this to access, benefits or healthcare, that's control, because they control all of it. Companies are in competition for your custom. They don't have the power or the authority to force you to do anything, which is why we understand and we accept that they will do as much as they can within the law to coerce you into buying their product. But at the end of the day, all these people want is your money. They're not trying to control your behaviour. Maybe influence you towards them, but that's where it ends. They take your money and that's it. Thank you very much, have a nice day, right? You get to walk away. You don't have to engage with that company ever again. You can return the product if you're not happy with it. Boy, would I love to do that with the government. But you can get a refund or an exchange, and you still have choices and you still have freedoms. When the government tried to behave like these private companies with all this soft talk of influence or nudges, you don't get to walk away. You don't get to get a refund. You don't get to get your money back. These people have control and power over you. And it's actually very sinister.
It's interesting because in the next section they talk about changing the context. Unlike a private company, these people have the ability to change the context. Like at most, if a private company wants to change the context of its product, it's going to change the packaging. These people, on the other hand, can say, right, we have a problem with pensions. What's the solution? I know, let's do something with the state pension, and then let's also do something with this in a soft nudge, and people will go with that option rather than ours, which is going bankrupt.
Well, yes, there's always an either or. Unfortunately, the or is always the worst case scenario, which only leaves you one other possible choice. But the best case scenario isn't the best of all possible options. It's the only other option you've been offered.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to note. I mean, I would say that the solution to the pensions problem is to have fewer people claiming a pension. But that's another podcast. Okay. So when they talk about changing behaviour, they go on to say, the presumption is that citizens and consumers will analyse the various pieces of information from politicians, not true, governments and markets, the numerous incentives offered to us, and act in ways that reflect their best interests. They're talking about there again, not us. See, we're on our own when it comes to things like this. However they define their best interests, or more paternalistically, however policymakers define them. This is important. However policymakers define them. They don't
However the government defines your best interests.
Yes.
Actually, no, sorry. However civil servants define your best interests.
So this is not about you and your choices at all. It's about you and their choices.
Mm-hmm.
Paternalistically, that's an interesting phrase.
Well, they don't call it daddy government for nothing.
It's like they care that we are children and they are the parent. And they're certainly trying to parent your children. And they're treating you like children. This snitch culture that we've come to is your children snitching to their new replacement parent, which is the state. I like the way, again, that these authors that we covered in the last segment constantly switch between all of us and then them and us. Their best interests, not our best interests. And however policymakers define them, these people are deciding what's in your best interest. These people control all of the context and all of the variables. You're not individuals to them. You are a group of... Well, there's plenty of words you could insert there. The disdain for us is apparent. Your interests are not their interests. And what benefits you and your family is not necessarily something they're going to allow to happen. And if it benefits them and it doesn't benefit you, can't please everyone, right?
Tough luck.
So that's very interesting.
They go on to say the context model recognizes that people are sometimes seemingly irrational and inconsistent in their choices, often because they're influenced by their surrounding factors. Therefore, it focuses more on changing behaviour without changing minds. This route receives less attention from researchers and policymakers. Basically, they want you to change your behaviour without recognising that you've changed it.
Because they don't care about changing your mind. They don't care that things disgust you or appall you or upset you.
They just want you to behave in a way that they approve of. That's it. That's their goal. They don't care about anything else.
They want you to believe in absurdities.
Just said it. They literally just said it. Changing behaviour without changing minds. They don't care about your opinion. They just want you to change. That's it.
So you just need to conform, sheep. It doesn't matter if you agree with that conformity or not, as long as you do it. Be a good little sheep and do as you're told. You can hate it, but you will do it, is essentially what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And they have not made, in certain policies, they've not made any effort to change minds. There's never been an open forum of discussion on certain policies or laws or legislation. They've just introduced it and told you you have to like it or else. And you are subject to it, whether you like it or not. They do talk about the different approaches to this. Changing behaviour and changing minds are obviously two different things. And they talk about these two different ways of thinking. And one way is called reflective and the other is automatic. And we all engage in this every day. Automatic behaviour is instinctive. It's your visceral reaction to something that you dislike or love. And it's an almost subconscious reaction. So Jordan might show me a picture of a kitten. And I'll say, oh, I can't help myself. It's my first reaction because I love kittens. And even if I was in the middle of the worst possible crisis, I would still have that reaction because it reaches me on an emotional level. And it's an automatic reaction that I have. And I don't have to think about it. It doesn't require any effort. It's my first reaction. It's my instinct. So they talk about this automatic reaction, and we have this to most things. Things that disgust us will pretty much always disgust us, unless, of course, our behaviour can be forced to change. We'll still be disgusted, but we won't be allowed to show it. And that comes down to an infringement of your freedoms. Think about all the things that you currently tolerate, that you are absolutely disgusted by, but that you on the surface have to conform to or else. Then you've got reflective behaviour. This would be where you have a chance to, before you react, to sit down and weigh up the pros and cons, to put some thought into it, to do some research maybe. As if someone put forward an idea and your immediate reaction was, no, that would never work. You may say, well, okay, I'm going to look into this. And then you might find a way that it could work. That's reflective. It's a slow thought process where you actually weigh everything up calmly, deliberately, and you make that decision. But even this is untrue because although you have these two processes, they're not playing to both of them. Your automatic system is the one, it's our go-to. It's the reason we've survived for so long. It's where you are told something is a truth, let's say. Something is a fact. Your reaction to it would be your true reaction. You agree with it, you disagree with it, you love it, you hate it, whatever. That is your true reaction. They don't care about your reflective reaction. They're not talking about go and have a think about it because there's never been an open forum on discussion on any of these legislative changes or these laws. In fact, I think the EU referendum was the last time the public were consulted in any great deal on anything. This use of the reflective is very underhand. They're implying that if you just take a bit more time to weigh up the information, you will actually come to the conclusion they want you to. And it may work in things like marketing, but we're talking about the state here, we're talking about the government, we're talking about policymakers, and this never happens. People have strong opinions on certain things for reasons, and those reasons might be very private and personal, but those reasons still exist. So we're in a position now where you either have to publicly agree with something, even though you know it's an absurdity. Like, I don't know, that there are more than two genders or more than two sexes. Anyone with any common sense understands that a man is a male born with a penis and a woman is a female born with a vagina. But you are forced to believe absurdities and to accept them publicly as based in reality. But your automatic reaction would be no. There's only two kinds of people who are born, and one is male and one is female. That's it. Everything else is made, created, coerced, manipulated. And they are, in effect, designed. These are not natural things. These are things that we create later on in life. So the automatic versus reflective, and the examples they've given here are ridiculous. I'm not going to go through them. But an automatic decision, just to give one example, would be that you recoil in disgust or horror at something. Like, I know, a dead dog. An awful thing to see. You'd feel sad and emotional and angry and upset. You wouldn't...
The thing that I find really interesting about this part is the fact that the people who are writing this are psychologists. They know what a reflective and automatic... Well, they know what a reflective and an automatic response is, but they've misled the people reading this report.
Yes.
By trying to claim that taking a daily commute is exactly the same as, or it is an automatic response when it isn't.
Well, yes, planning an unfamiliar journey is not the same as a daily commute. It doesn't matter how long you have to think about it. That's not true. And it will never be true. This is, again, trying to force you to believe in absurdities. It doesn't matter if the absurdity is benign, like taking a daily commute or planning a journey that's unfamiliar. It's the fact that they're trying to get you to switch your brain into this kind of crazy thinking, where things that appear natural and automatic can somehow be turned on their head into something completely different if you just give it a bit more thought. There is no going away from that picture of a dead dog. I'm sorry to use that. It's the worst thing I can think of right now. There's no going away from it and thinking about it over a few days and coming back and saying, well, actually, it's not so bad. Of course it's bad. It's terrible. That's a reality. It's a terrible thing, and it will never not be terrible. These examples they've given are just so much whitewash, it's unbelievable. Desiring cake and counting calories. They don't even make sense.
As I said, to me, it's just really interesting that these people have used these examples to try and mislead the people who are reading this.
Yes.
It's just weird. It's just weird. There's nothing else to say.
Well, it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. These people do not understand people. These behavioural psychologists. Who the hell have they been studying? How did they get their qualifications? This is not normal behaviour. They do not understand normal behaviour. To have these things in direct contradiction with each other, where you would take the same thing and depending on how you react to it, reflectively or automatically, you would come up with two completely separate things. It just doesn't compute. It's not normal behaviour. You cannot make a reality into an unreality and accept it. It's really quite amazing. These are the people advising your government right now. And when I say your government, I mean all of you. Because the Behavioural Insights team don't just operate in the UK. They have offices all over the world. And again, we'll cover that in the future, I promise.
Indeed. I think that's all for this, is it not?
I think so. Oh, no, it's a little bit more. There we go.
Is it?
This is the last part.
Oh, I forgot about that. Fair enough.
So now they talk about the limits to information. I'll read the first part and I'll let you finish up. Across the world, policymakers are giving citizens more and more information about the performance of schools, hospitals and other public services to be mashed, question marks, and recirculated in a myriad of innovative and personalised ways.
We spoke about the word mashed being there early on. It is irrelevant. It doesn't actually matter what word they've used, but that is a really strange word to pop up in any sort of official document.
Yeah, it's a very colloquial term, isn't it? Why don't you use a term like, I don't know...
combine.
Yes, combined, put together. They'll probably, I'm surprised they didn't use like something like recombobulated. It's just made up. It's ridiculous. These are academics who work for the government whose wages we pay. Well, we pay their wages probably. Amazing. Anyway, over to you.
Indeed. Information is obviously important in its own right, as it leads to a more fully informed consumer and citizens. That's strange in and of itself. Surely consumers are citizens. So, even if information has no direct effect on behaviour.
Oh, well. Sorry to waste your time, government stooges.
Consumers in that context must be private businesses.
Well, when they talk about consumers, are they talking about consumers of their product or us as consumers of private business product?
No, I think they're on about selling data to private companies. Or maybe not selling, but making the data available to private companies.
Whose data?
Our data.
Of course.
Naturally. Who else is it going to be?
Well, it certainly wouldn't be their own. I'm sure these people have all kinds of things in place to protect their data.
Their data is nice and secure.
Isn't it just?
But we also know that providing information per se often has surprisingly modest and sometimes even unintended impacts when it attempts to change individuals' behaviours, at least when viewed through the conventional, sorry. I don't know what happened with my brain there. I think I'm used to reading the word, that's the problem. Conventional rational model of behaviour, and perhaps also when viewed by a policymaker charged with getting value for money and reducing inequalities.
They keep talking about inequalities.
Keep talking about value for money.
Well, all they care about is money. All we've heard for the last year is GDP. But this inequalities, they create inequalities. They create them. So when they talk about reducing them, maybe they should just all resign, and then inequalities would just disappear.
Council housing is a wonderful example of that. Council housing is a wonderful example of that, and the flats that they used to build in the 60s, which are now widely accepted as being a driving factor in poverty.
And crime.
And crime as well, don't forget that.
The way they've been designed and laid out, I mean, you've got... Well, I grew up in a council flat. The way they've been designed and laid out has... Your front door is not open to the public. I don't mean open to the public, I mean viewed from a public thoroughfare. So a lot of people can break into these flats because all of the front doors are inside the building. So I've got a fundamental issue with blocks of flats. Honestly, I hate them. We used to call them tenement blocks because it's such a nasty dystopian word, and it's a correct word. You can have a little palace inside your flat, of course, but they do breed crime because it's hidden away from the public eye. I used to have a friend who lived in a block in particular in East London, and she used to have, I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, that glass with a wire through, like dices, like squares of wire.
The sort of stuff that you used to have in schools.
Yes, exactly. Well, this was on her front door, and someone broke in, and they got away with it because, of course, none of the neighbours would speak because of the kind of gang mentality that was there then. But also the fact that it was out of sight. You know, you could break in. This glass didn't shatter either. It didn't make a loud noise because it was all this tempered glass. And because it had this wire kind of threaded through it, it didn't shatter or crash to the floor. It just kind of moved away like a net or a screen. And, you know, her home got broken into, and the few things of, I wouldn't even say things of value. She was a working class girl and so was her family. But things that had value to them, they're just all gone. All of them. The stupid things. Little trinkets and photographs, and like a photo in a silver frame. They'd take the whole thing just to sell the silver frame, you know. And the photograph will end up on the street somewhere, covered in footprints and mud and dirt. But these flats were they were a hive of criminal activity because everything was out of sight of the public. You didn't even have to look over your shoulder to see if anyone was coming because you were in this kind of little sort of communal area with like 5 front doors in it or 4 front doors in it. And you probably could turn over all 4 of those flats if you knew everyone was out.
And it's really important to emphasise the fact that they were only built because the government decided they had to be built.
Well,
all those flats were built by the government. None of those were built by private companies.
And can I just add to that point as well? When those flats were built, we didn't have a housing crisis. We weren't packed to the gills, as they say.
No, when you look at the marketing material for them, they were actually they were quite proud of them. They were quite important things. The market material for those flats are quite interesting to read. It's the same as new towns. Whenever you look at the old videos and the old news reports from Milton Keynes and places like that, they're not
Well, these
You know,
weren't shoddy, knocked up in 5-minute jobs either. These were sound, really well built flats.
These were planned. These were planned. These people believed, with all the research that they had done at the time, that these places were going to be wondrous palaces to live in.
Why on earth would they think that people, especially people with young families, wouldn't benefit from fresh air and a garden? We didn't have the lack of space then. There's no justifiable reason to put up these monstrous dystopian tower blocks. We had loads of... I mean, we're building now on green space, on what used to be considered protected land, because there is so much immigration into our country that there isn't room to swing a cat. Sorry, cats. But you get my point. We're now actually building on protected land because there are too many people and not enough houses. But these flats were built back in, the 60s?
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't the same issue, the overpopulation issue then. So who on earth thought this was a good idea, to build these awful, monstrous blocks of concrete instead of homes with character and grace? I mean, they were cheap, I suppose, right? I mean, what justification was there? But families were getting placed in these flats. Families were young children, like toddlers. And they had these stupid balconies that toddlers could just climb through the bars and off the edge. I genuinely wonder what went through people's minds when they built these. Of course, the people overseeing the design of these things never had to live in them themselves, right? Don't even start me on kitchens. Like general kitchens. People who use kitchens should design kitchens, that's all I'm saying. But yes, crime... I think crime is people's cry for help. It's a way out. And I'm not making excuses for it. But there are some people for whom their start in life was going to be their end. But it comes back to these nudges. As you say, the marketing for it was kind of progressive for its time, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
It's kind
of, as
of
I said, they were really proud of it. They were really, really impressed with what they'd built. And fair enough, I suppose. You know, they didn't really have foresight of what they were doing, but it didn't work at all. But the really important thing to point out there was that it was built by government, and it was incredibly well-respected people at the time building these things and saying, "Oh, this is the future right here."
I wonder if at that time they knew what the future would hold. Again, I'm trying to conclude in my mind why anyone would think that these were a good idea. I genuinely can't get my head around it. I mean, I suppose they looked amazing when they were first built, right? They were clean and well lit. Well, for the time. Probably the equivalent of my car's headlamps. But for the time. But it does bring up the issue of crime. Does poverty lead to crime? Is poverty a state of mind? Can you nudge someone out of poverty, is the question. I don't think poverty necessarily leads to crime. I know a lot of people who grew up with nothing, who've never committed a crime to get ahead. I know lots of people who've worked incredibly hard to get ahead. But yes, I mean, poverty and crime really comes back to this idea of the way the government view us, doesn't it? The reason they think we need to be nudged, that we aren't fit to make our own life choices. Do you think they trust us to make choices?
No, I think this document just outright says in multiple places that they don't trust us at all. That's really what this document is all about. It's about how the government doesn't trust us to make decisions and how they have to be involved with them all.
The nudge unit is obviously quite a new phenomenon, although arguably they've been using psychology against us for a long time.
Yeah, this is the formalisation of what they've done for decades. what they're always trying to do. They're just trying to be more efficient at it.
Very interesting, and I'm sure we'll find out more as we carry on. I think it's about time to wrap up for this episode. We've gone on way longer than we planned to. There's so much information, as you can probably imagine.
It's almost bedtime, love.
So, yeah, do bear with us. There's loads to go through.
There's a lot of information. There's a lot of talking points in it. That's the problem. It's because, people can see there's large sections of this that we've left out. But there's still a hell of a lot in here that's actually interesting to pick apart.
Yes. So, anyway, so that's it for this part. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you found it enlightening. Please do share it around if you want to give anyone an insight into what the government really thinks about people. Them and us and we and our and interchangeable use of pronouns there. We do hope you enjoyed it. We hope that you tune in for the next episode. Mm-hmm. And as usual, we will be with you tomorrow night at 7:30. So we hope you'll turn up then. If you have any questions about the series, feel free to ask them. But we're not going to give away any spoilers. Yes, we'd love to get your comments. You may have come across something we haven't covered yet, or something we've skipped over that you think is important. So yes, we'd love some feedback. As always, we hope you have a fantastic evening, and we'll see you soon. It's bye from me.
And bye from her.
And him. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye for now.